Gremlins! This week I want to try customizing a plushie. I'm inspired by the work of Rabbit from the channel Radis. I'm going to rewatch a bunch of their old videos because they do a lot of plushie customizations, especially very punk and alternative plushie customizations, and I really want to try it. So I bought this adorable brown teddy bear plushie secondhand. I've already washed him. And my next step is to sketch out a bunch of ideas because I've got a few ideas of the kind of things I want to add and change about him to make him cool and custom, but I need to sketch out a bunch of ideas, figure out what I'm going to do, and then start working on that. I didn't film the process of my sketching, mostly because I sketched this last night in an autism nest. I had a rough day and just basically curled up under my desk with a bunch of pillows and plushies and did some art and watched some old videos. But the point is, I was not in a headspace for filming, but this is my sketch. I'm going to just put a photo of that up on the screen because that will probably be a lot easier to see. And that way I can also refer to my sketch while I talk. So the main elements that I have decided I want to go with is little antlers, probably with wire, possibly removable for cuddle purposes. I also want little patches of moss around the teddy bear on various places, a mix of moss that is going to be knitted out of this really nice textured wool that I have, since I have picked up knitting again for the first time in a while, and also possibly patches of moss that are embroidered onto other pieces of fabric and then the fabric is sewn on. I'm not entirely sure how I'll do that yet, but I will try something. This is a experiment. Then I also want patches on the front chest, like here, little white patches that look like a slightly cartoony ribcage. And I want to make possibly a little mushroom necklace instead of the bow tie, and possibly some little piercings in his ears. The main elements of this will be the antlers, the moss, and the ribcage. Antlers, moss, ribcage. Those are the three major things that I'm going to be working on making. I'm going to make all the elements and then figure out how to attach them to the teddy bear. So that's going to be my evening, and I'm probably going to start with either the moss or the ribcage pieces because I feel like doing fabric crafts tonight. I decided to start with the ribcage and grab some white cotton fabric left over from a different project. I lightly sketched a very simplified sternum and 6 ribs, 3 for each side. The ribs are just kind of slightly curved oblongs, the top ones shorter than the bottom ones. I cut the bones out, leaving a centimeter of seam allowance around each shape. Then I went bone by bone, pinning the seam allowance in and using long tacking stitches to hold everything in place. My tacking thread is bright red, partly because I don't use red often and don't mind wasting it on temporary stitches, and partly because it shows up really well against the white fabric, so it will be easy to remove later. The tacking stitches hold the bones in shape until I add more secure stitches later, which I'm also going to be using to attach the bones to the bear, killing 2 birds with 1 stone and saving myself time and thread. I pinned the bones to the bear's chest, took a break, then moved to the couch to start sewing around each bone with small white stitches to hold everything in place. I quickly realized that sewing these tiny pieces of fabric to a 3D bear was a lot more difficult than I had anticipated. What I really needed for this process was a curved needle, which I don't own. I've accidentally bent pins in the past though, so I thought maybe I could bend a needle into shape. So once I discarded the needle I just snapped in half, I abandoned that idea and just did my best, wrangling the bear into all sorts of angles to get the stitches through. Also, watching this footage back while I write the script, yikes, my posture is bad. No wonder my back hurts. This process took a while. I'm usually a quick sewer, but the bear was hard to stitch into. I spent the time listening to Rabbit's DIY videos, especially the plushie-related DIYs, which kept my motivation up. Finally, I got each bone sewn in place, and it actually looks pretty good. I especially love how the chest patches flatten the fur under them, so the fur between the bones sticks out in a very textural way. It really looks like an exposed ribcage on an animal that still has its hide, but in a much cuter way. I have skeleton bear. I have a skeleton bear. That was a lot harder to sew than I thought it would be. This was challenging, but it's so worth it. I mean, it's slightly uneven, but I don't think it matters that much. I love it so much. Also, the texture, like the texture difference between the fur and the ribs is actually really fun to just like run my hands over. But anyway, I'm really loving him so far. And the next step is moss. But first I need to take a break and move my body a bit because my back is hurting. And probably also get a snack and some water and stuff. But I will probably at least get a start on the moss tonight because the moss might take me a while because at least some of the moss is going to be embroidered. And embroidery takes a while. Anyway, I just love him. He's so cuddly. Yay! Also, we're matching. I just realized I'm wearing my Animal Bones t-shirt, which fits the vibe. Anyway, yes, I'm rambling at this point. I'll see you in a bit. So I was going to film myself and then speed it up, the process of embroidering moss, but my phone is at kind of really low battery, and I'm worried that if I try filming myself, even if I have it plugged in the whole time that I'm filming, that it will drain more than it's charged, and then I'll end up losing the progress. So instead, I'm just going to check in now to say that I'm about to start embroidering, and then I'll check in throughout the process, but leave my phone off to the side to be able to charge properly while I work. I've got embroidery hoop set up here, and I'm just going to embroider some like organic looking patches of moss that I can then cut out of the fabric and sew on to my teddy bear, because I don't want to try embroidering onto this 3D plushie. Sewing was hard enough, I'm going to embroider on a flat surface. For the first moss patch I embroidered, I took a photo of each stage of the process, which you can see here. I used 5 shades of green thread and 2 different stitches to create a varied and textured look. I then decided to film the creation of one patch of moss and explain, as best I can, each of the stitches I used. Okay, my phone has charged now, and I'm going to try and show how I'm embroidering this moss, just in case you want to try this as well. I don't know how well this is going to go. This is a very strange camera angle for me, but we'll see how this works. I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm mostly self-taught when it comes to embroidery, learning through Pinterest diagrams and random Instagram posts or reels. I don't know the official names of most of the stitches I use, and I don't know if I'm using a normal method. However, I'll do my best here. I'm starting with a kind of loop stitch. To do this, I pull the thread through from the underside to the top, then put the needle back right next to the exit point and pull through again, stopping before all the thread goes through to leave a loop behind. I then hold the loop in place with my finger and add a couple of anchoring stitches to the base, before moving on to the next loop. I repeat until I have a decent number of these stitches, then tie off my thread and snip through each loop with some tiny scissors, leaving the ends of the thread loose and feathery. The next stitch I use is the French knot. Basically, I pull my needle from the underside up, then thread my needle through a tiny section of fabric so that both ends of the needle are on the upper side. I then take my length of thread, still threaded through the needle, and wind it 3 to 4 times around the point of the needle fairly tightly. I then pull my needle through those stitches and push it back down through the fabric to anchor my French knot in place. This makes a kind of ball-shaped stitch, which I repeat with 3 different shades of green to make the bulk of the moss. I used a light green, medium green, and very dark green, and tried to position my stitches so that the light is in the center, the medium green is around the light green, and the dark is at the edges in small amounts to create the illusion of light and shadow on the moss. As I sew, I'm also using the tip of my needle to rescue any loop threads from my first set of stitches that accidentally get covered by my French knots. Finally, I go back to my loop stitches in another shade of green, and in any gaps or places that need to be broken up, I add more loops, smaller this time, with their anchor stitches. This time, I leave the loops as is rather than cutting them, making 3 textures of moss using 2 simple stitches. Every time I switched thread, I left a few centimeters at least of my previous thread color hanging loose on the underside of my embroidery. My last step is to tie all my threads together, knotting those loose threads to secure everything. This can be very messy since none of these will be visible. Finally, I trim the excess thread beyond the knots and move on to my next patch of moss. Since all these patches will be cut out, I don't use the same length of thread between patches. I'm matching him. It's the next day, by the way. I did not finish making the moss last night because I was tired, but I have finished making the moss now. I have 6 little moss patches that I've sewn, and my next step with this would be to cut out around the moss patches and then sew the fabric onto my bear. But before I do that, I'm going to make some more moss, but this time knitted. I've already made this. This was an experiment to see if it worked. I don't know if this patch is too big. I might save this to put on something larger than a teddy bear. So anyway, I'm gonna spend the next however long it takes knitting myself some small little patches of moss with this really cool textured yarn that I cannot embroider with, sadly, because the yarn is too thick. I have tried in the past, This is at least part of the reason why I picked up knitting again, because I want to be able to make use of this really cool mossy texture yarn that I found in a thrift store a few months ago. The next stage of moss creation was knitting. I picked up knitting again a few weeks ago, after abandoning it for 10 years, and yes, I'm using coloured pencils as my knitting needles. Basically, my friend, the bearded gremlin, and I were on a call, and I offhandedly mentioned that I could probably use a coloured pencil as a knitting needle in a pinch. He told me there was no way that would work. I said bet, and taught myself how to knit on that very call. Turns out, coloured pencils work surprisingly well as knitting needles, and in the last 2 weeks I've knitted myself a pair of fingerless gloves, a dozen moss patches, and half a tiny sweater for a different teddy bear that I own. The important knitting project for this video is the moss. I bought this moss textured yarn months ago, hoping to use it for embroidery and pom-pom making. It worked just fine for pom-poms, but sadly is too thick to be used for embroidery, at least on the fabrics that I tried it with. So the yarn has been mostly abandoned in my sewing stash for ages. However, now that I can knit again, it's finally getting its time to shine. Moss is really easy to knit with yarn like this. Each patch is only a few stitches across and a few rows long, since making them too big overpowers this tiny bear. Okay, I've got 4 moss patches, knitted moss patches, and I'm going to now cut out the moss patches from this and start attaching my moss patches to my bear and seeing if I'm going to need to make more or if I've got enough. This is actually really fun, and I'm definitely going to keep using this yarn to make more moss patches to put on other things, because I love moss, and embroidering it is fun, but it does take a long time to make not that much, so being able to knit it, now that is a game changer. Anyway, let's see how this works. I gave the moss patches about as much seam allowance as I gave the bones, around 1 centimeter. I was also very careful not to accidentally cut through any of my threads on either side of the fabric. I was going to use the same red tacking stitches as I did for the bones, but then changed my mind and decided to tack the raw edges in place with green, so I don't have to remove the stitches later. The embroidery plus all the raw edges folded over in a very small space make these moss patches quite thick, but I still managed to attach them to the bear without much more difficulty than the bones. I don't have a particular plan when placing the moss, just trying to make sure it's spread out so the bear is kind of equally mossy all over. I also switched between sewing the embroidered moss patches on and the knitted ones. The knitted patches were so easy to sew in place, and my stitches are huge, but between the moss fuzz and the bear's fur, they still end up invisible, which is very cool. I was getting so excited as I added the moss to the bear, it's looking incredible, and now I have the itch to add moss in this style to a lot of other things. Attaching the moss has gone really well. I'm loving how it looks. I don't quite have enough. I decided that this moss piece, the piece that I knitted first, was just a bit too big for the size of the teddy bear, or just looked too much. So I'm going to knit myself a couple more moss chunks to put on the back of the teddy bear, because on the front he's looking amazing, and then on the back there's like nothing there. So I'm going to knit myself a couple more of these, maybe 2 or 3, and then I'm going to attach those, and then I can move on from the moss to the final aspects of the teddy bear. I don't know if I'll do those today or tomorrow though, but I'm definitely going to finish the moss today. Time to knit some more! I'm just continuing to watch a bunch of rabbits' old videos while I work. Their content is just so motivating when I'm doing my own DIYs. I'm also finally confident enough in my knitting skill to stop looking up a tutorial every time I cast on or cast off. Yay! I don't understand how it's taking me this long to appreciate knitting. I hated it as a kid, much to my mother's disappointment, and I never finished a project. However, it's so relaxing, especially when I don't have to count my stitches. It's a calming, repetitive motion that I can keep my hands busy with while I watch videos. It's basically a stim that's also productive. I will be continuing this hobby. I ended up knitting 3 more small moss patches, then going back to attaching the moss to my bear. While settling down to start sewing the rest of the moss onto the bear, I also rediscovered one more embroidery patch that had gotten misplaced, and was able to attach that as well as my new knitted patches. This bear is looking much more evenly mossy now, and I think it looks fantastic. He's mossy now, and I love it! It looks so good in my opinion, and it was actually a lot easier to attach than I thought it would be. I love all the just different textures that are appearing on this bear. He's gonna be so fun to hold and play with. Anyway, the next steps for this design will be to figure out how to make little antlers for him, and also figuring out any jewelry. I kind of want to do some kind of like mushroom charm jewelry. But I think I'm done for tonight. It's not like evening yet, but I've had a tiring week, and I kind of just want to curl up with a book or something this evening. I want to make myself dinner and just like curl up and chill and not have to worry about filming, and, you know, give myself an actual bit of a break. So anyway, this is him for now. I am absolutely loving how this is turning out. I'm having so much fun with this. I'm going to end up buying more plushies and mossing them probably, or mossing other things, because, I mean, now I have this way of making moss, which is super quick, plus the embroidery way, which is less quick, but still fun. I want to put moss in everything now. So anyway, yeah, I will check in with you again tomorrow to start working on the next stages. Continuing to make progress with the bear, the next step is antlers. And my plan for the antlers is to use wire, then aluminum foil around the wire to thicken it up, and then probably wrap some fabric around it to make it at least somewhat soft. My original thought was to be paper mache, but I feel like fabric will work better. I'm also hoping to figure out a way to make these removable, like they can poke in and out of his head, so that they're not a risk to eyes when I want to cuddle the bear. So I'm going to start by just cutting my wire in two and twisting it into a vague antler shape. Also, this is a good test practice because at some point I want to try making myself a pair of antlers. So this is a good test of methodology. I don't have proper wire tools. What I have is this pair of scissors and a tiny set of low-quality jewelry pliers, but somehow I made this work. I cut my wire in half and bent each piece into a two-pronged antler shape, with the bottom bits of the wire splayed out for attachment purposes. I then cut off the excess to stash in my craft drawer, never to be used again probably. Next I opened my aluminum foil, apparently for the first time, and began ripping chunks off to crumple around my wires. I really thought the aluminum would stick to itself better, but it was good enough to glue onto later, so it works. The antlers aren't particularly even, but it's all part of the charm. I have my little antlers. They're adorable. The foil is not sticking to them as well as I hoped it would, but the foil is just an underlayer, and my next step is to add fabric layered with glue to wrap around them to make them kind of soft and also brown. And then I think my method for sticking them on is going to be to make a couple more little knitted moss patches, and then I can weave the loose wire ends into those. In between the knitting to hold them in place. I don't know if this will work, but I'm gonna try it. I have some more scrap fabric from a different project here. This time, it's brown. I cut a couple thin strips of this fabric, tried to hot glue one end to the base of one of my antlers, realized that hot glue doesn't stick to foil, then switched to just using PVA glue. I basically just soaked the fabric in PVA glue and wrapped it in a spiral around my foil antler until it reached the top. The glue will hopefully secure all the raw edges and make the whole thing hold together. I ended up just spreading a layer of glue on top of all the fabric to keep it from peeling, and let that dry while I started on the next antler. I used 2 layers of PVA glue on each antler, but added the second layer off camera. The glue kind of defeats the purpose of the fabric being soft and woven textured, but if I hadn't used as much, I don't think the fabric would have stayed well. I have myself some antlers now. They're very cute. They're quite shiny because of the layers of glue I put on them, but I think they should work. They are at least somewhat soft, and now I need to figure out a way to attach them to the bear in which they shall hopefully be at least semi-removable. I've made off camera, I made myself a couple of more moss patches. I'm going to see if sewing the moss patches onto the head and then threading the antler wires into the moss patches will be stable enough that it works while leaving the antlers at least somewhat removable. So, I've got all my sewing supplies here, we'll see if this works. It didn't quite work the way I'd hoped. The moss was very good for hiding the antler wire, but threading 2 wires going in opposite directions into the moss was tricky, and I don't think this was the method to use to make these antlers removable. Also, with just the moss holding them in place, the antlers were very unstable and wobbly, so I had to add a bunch of stitches around the wire to fix that. I think if I really wanted to remove the antlers, I could, but I wouldn't call them removable. They do look good though, and my head can fit between them for cuddling purposes, so the bear is still huggable. He's almost done! He's almost done! There's just some final finishing touches I want to add. I'm going to give him a bit of jewelry. I'm not going to make the mushroom necklaces that I was originally planning to, because I realized I kind of left it too late, and since I want to finish him this weekend, I don't have time to wait for clay to dry. I might come back and add that later, or I might not, depending on how the jewelry I am going to give him turns out. I'm going to just add the jewelry off camera. I'm just going to scout around my apartment and find anything that can be cute and cool to add, and then I'm going to film some reveal footage. So stay tuned to see some high-quality pictures and videos of this guy. is really exciting. He came out so well. I'm so happy with the result of this. He is just so cute. I love him. He's exactly my aesthetic. Very cuddly as well, as long as I don't poke my eye on these. He needs a name. He needs a name, and I would love to hear any suggestions you've got in the comments. I'm probably going to, on my Instagram in a few days, put a poll up of any suggestions I get, and also any ideas that I come up with myself, and then you can vote on a name. Unless I find a name that is just absolutely perfect, and then I'll just choose it. But I'm so happy with this process. It was so much fun to work on. I now want to customize so many more plushies, and I need to restrain myself because I don't have all that much space in my apartment. He's gonna sit beside me like a little guy. I'm so happy with this. And yeah, that's all for this week. Thanks for coming along and watching me create him. He was so much fun to work on. I keep saying that. I'm very excited by this. I'm also very tired. Anyway, until next time, bye!